it's time we come out and address the elephant in the room. We talk about the current state of the fantasy genre. We talk about Lord of the Rings and how it will fail compared to the epic Zelda movie coming in 2027. That's right. The official Harmon Smith take on this situation is that Lord of the Rings that the Legend of Zelda movies will be far more successful and popular than that drivel from Middle-earth, right? You know, I have way more credibility in the fantasy genre than you do, right? I'm a fantasy author myself. You know, I know very well that The Legend of Zelda has long ago surpassed Tolkien when it comes to its creativity, its contributions to the fantasy genre, truly revolutionizing this type of story in a completely new format, right? I think a lot of people don't understand how big of a deal that is. That Zelda is the defining fantasy game, far beyond that of anything else in the industry. Like, my grandma knows what Zelda is, right? So going into this movie, right, going into the hype season, people are beginning to notice things. Well, it's being filmed in New Zealand, and it's a trilogy. It seems like they want to be Lord of the Rings. No, Zelda will be better than Lord of the Rings, and without even really trying, because Zelda offers more appealing aspects to our general culture. It's more reflective of our values. It's a tried and true fantasy story that's told over and over again throughout the decades, as opposed to Lord of the Rings, which is just some kind of subversion to that. Bill, Frodo was not able to destroy the ring by his own power at the end. This Lord of the Rings is not as good as people make it out to be. It is not some all-defining classic. It is not the greatest in the fantasy genre. It did not invent fantasy, right? That's something I keep hearing people talk about. It's not like the greatest book ever written. It's not the greatest fantasy story ever told. It's not even the best fantasy book in his friend group, right? That's just how far behind Tolkien lags compared to modern contemporaries, right? Harry Potter was better, and Zelda will prove itself to be better once it's adapted to the silver screen. And the fact that people are coping so hard about this is simply an example of just how thoroughly the cult of Tolkien has mind-raped people who don't actually read fantasy stories. Because when you actually read more fantasy books outside of Lord of the Rings, you do start to realize that the pacing is poor. The characterization isn't that interesting. It's more about the exposition than anything else. There are all these really very real problems with Lord of the Rings that simply aren't present in better books. And it's not something we talk about because we have to put Tolkien on a pedestal, right? We can't address the fact that this guy isn't some literary masterpiece, right? He wrote Lord of the Rings, he's the best. He's the best because plebs believe he's the best, right? It has nothing to do with the actual story or its actual contributions to fantasy. When you actually look at the contributions to fantasy, what do you get? You get a bunch of knockoff products like D&D and Ultima that do nothing to innovate or do add absolutely nothing new. They basically just let's just have the Balrog come at you. Ooh, Ultima Zero did that, right? You fight the Balrog. No creativity, no originality. It is just the same thing that Tolkien did, right? There was no creativity from the followers of Tolkien. They don't understand how fantasy works. Like, they just have this mindset where, like, well, Tolkien did this, so, like, that's what fantasy is now. But that's not true, like, at all. Even back then, it wasn't true. Like, it's, to me, I think, worshipping Lord of the Rings is just kind of the literary equivalent of propping up, I don't know, like Oscar winners or like Game Awards nominees, because like these products aren't high quality, they're not interesting, nobody engages with them or enjoys them or understands them on any capacity, right? How many people do you know who like have seriously read the Silmarillion, right? Like, there are better things out there, but you will never ever see anybody outside of like core fantasy enthusiasts talk about them at all, right? Like, this is like the reality of the situation, is that the people who worship Lord of the Rings and think it's the greatest thing ever simply don't read other fantasy stories, right? Like, again, like, people notice this about Harry Potter fans. I'm a Harry Potter fan, but like, there was no denying that before the whole tranny thing came to light, there was this very big like community of people who like were huge Harry Potter fans, considered the best ever, and yet didn't have any wider perspective. They didn't know anything about other fantasy book series, right? Like, they didn't have any real experience with that. And so, like, that became a meme. Like, read another book, right? And that's applied to Harry Potter specifically, right? That's a very uniquely, like, millennial phenomenon. But, like, I do think the boomer equivalent is Lord of the Rings. Because there is no denying. The film adaptations were not good. They weren't interesting. The subsequent material hasn't been great. The toys, like video games, right? Like, nobody has ever really been able to turn Lord of the Rings into a franchise, even though they've like desperately been trying to make it such over the past 20 years in order to ruin its legacy. Lord of the Rings is a book. It's not a movie. It's not an Amazon series. It's not like it's a book. Okay. Like, and I do think the fact of the matter is that the fact that so many people don't read the book or even understand like critical aspects of the book, it just completely flies in the face of like any credibility that they have when they try and tell you that like the Lord of the Rings films are something special, because the films do make a lot of continuity mistakes. They do make a lot of changes. None of them make sense if you're enthusiastic enough about the source material to follow along with it and support it. Like, I have never supported the Lord of the Rings movies. I've always been against like that, book adaptations, because they're always garbage. But like, I don't think the Zelda movie is going to have the same problems. Like, I do think that is going to be the big thing about Zelda specifically, is that it isn't going to be adapting any particular game. It's going to be its own thing, following similar concepts, right? So the creators are going to have a lot more creative freedom. Nintendo's going to be involved. And it's just going to be a significantly superior experience than watching a heavily condensed, bastardized version of the book adapted onto the silver screen, right? Like, Zelda is going to be better than Lord of the Rings by the simple fact that it is a far more adaptable franchise. There is a lot more they can do with Zelda that they would never be able to do with Lord of the Rings, right? Like, and I think that it's just a testament of just how much more successful Zelda has been as a franchise, right? Not just one specific game, not just because like Ocarina of Time is the greatest game ever made or anything like that. Like no, Zelda has remained very relevant since 1986. You know, constantly growing, constantly evolving, introducing new concepts. You know, bringing in more and more players all the time, and just becoming this huge thing. Whereas in a lot of ways, Lord of the Rings is a relic of the time period it came from, and that's one of the things I realized when like I read it recently, is that like all the things I really appreciated about it is that it is a hallmark of what true British culture was like. You know, real the real culture, like, and I do value the work for that reason, but that's not the reason that most people put it up on a pedestal, right? You know, they don't celebrate it for like how based and traditional it is. They celebrate it out of some arbitrary feeling that it's the best, not because they like have any real attachment to it or understand it or appreciate it at all. Like they like Lord of the Rings because they're supposed to. And to me, that's just a very strong testament to just how far we've fallen as a culture, where people can't look at something like this and develop an actual opinion about the work outside of some vague, non-committal like feeling that it's the best thing ever because everyone told me it was.